that we no longer use anymore and chuck it in the bowl. Okay, our speaker today is Roger Eatwell. Roger is Emeritus Professor of Comparative Politics at the University of Bath. He's written widely on contemporary politics and 20th century history, including a history of fascism. And he's the co-author with his PhD student, Matthew Goodwin. I presume the PhD studenting was some time ago, because I think Matthew is now a professor himself at Kent University. They co-wrote a Pelican bestseller called National Populism, The Revolt Against Liberal Democracy, which came out in 2018, and it's a very good read. I thoroughly recommend it. So with the election of Joe Biden and the imminent implosion of Boris Johnson, has populism peaked? Well, Roger is here to tell us what he thinks. So will you please give Roger a very warm welcome?
Thank you, David, and thank you for asking me. As I'm not wearing a mask and I've got a slight cold, I may even cough slightly, can I tell you I'm triple vaccinated, Pfizer, and I've done a lateral flow test this morning and I'm negative, so you don't have to worry, I hope, about me. In 2017, the Cambridge Dictionary decided that populism was its word of the year. I think the reasons for this are fairly clear. If we look around the world, there have been a rapid growth in the new millennium of populist movements in a variety of countries. So we have, for example, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Narendra Modi in India, and then, of course, immediately before the Cambridge Dictionary's decision, we have the Brexit vote in Britain, and we have Donald Trump elected at the end of 2016 in the USA. And what I want to do today is focus in a slightly narrow way on Europe and the USA, because if we were to look at Modi in India or Bolsonaro in Brazil, we start getting into lots of other issues, and it will be very difficult to keep the talk fairly short. So I'm hoping it's narrow, but not too narrow at the world level. And I want to look at four broad questions, or rather three, and the fourth I think will come up more in Q&A, I hope. The first question I want to look at is, what actually is populism? We've got Hugo Chavez, a left-winger. We've got Narendra Modi, a right-winger, a religious, a devout Hindu who's manipulated the situation against Muslims in India. And so what have they got in common? Brexit, there are left-wing Brexit voters, right-wing Brexit voters. What have they got in common? Why are we lumping all these things together and calling it populist? So that's my first question. What actually is populism? Can you define it, or is it just one of those boo terms? Because remember, you hardly ever will find anyone say, I am a populist. I know people who say I'm a socialist, I know people who say I'm a conservative, I know people who say I'm a green, even Liberal Democrat recently. I'm a populist. I've hardly ever heard anyone say I am a populist. So firstly, can we define this elusive term? Secondly, is populism a major threat to democracy? Because if we look at academics, scholars, as Americans would say, we look at journalists, almost all of them are hostile to populism. Now, does that reflect the fact that large numbers of people in British and American academia tend to be left of centre, not necessarily socialist, but very few people that I know in academia would call themselves conservative with a big C, and probably very few even with a small c. So is there some kind of bias here against populism? Or is this really something that is a major threat to the democratic system? So that's my second question. My third question, what's actually driving all this? Why have all these movements, especially the ones I'm going to focus on, which are in Europe and the USA, why have they been moving forward? Is it largely a protest against things like the 2008 Great Recession and the following policies, austerity in Britain, which hit a lot of people very hard? Or if you were to look at Germany, 2015, Angela Merkel allows in 1 million migrants, mainly coming from the Middle East and so on. Is it a protest against those kind of things? Or is there something more fundamental going on here? And that leads me to my fourth question. I'm really only just going to touch on this because I'm hoping we can pick this up more in Q&A, because I don't want to talk for too long. And this is, have we reached peak populism? Is this now something that's in decline? Donald Trump obviously lost in 2020. And if we look around Europe, a whole series of movements that are typically called populists have seen falling votes recently. So if any of you are interested in Italy, the party that 3 years ago had the highest standing in opinion polls, a party called the Lega, the League, had well over 30% of the vote. It's down yesterday when I looked to about 19%. So many would argue that we've hit peak populism. We're now seeing the decline of this movement, and it's really something that's more for the past. Okay, question number one. How do we define populism? This is a massive debate among academics because it varies so much. So trying to find a common essence is something that's caused a lot of discussion. And I think broadly speaking, there are two main approaches among those who say we should try to define it. Some would say we shouldn't. It's just so confusing, so diverse. It's just a boo word. It's a pejorative word that we really shouldn't try to put meaning within it. So what are these two broad approaches? Well, firstly, there's what I think I'd call the supply side approach. The supply side looks at the supply of language, the supply of image, how politicians, how leaders act. And this is very much, I think, the essence of the Cambridge definition, the Cambridge Dictionary definition. I'm just going to read it to you. It's a very brief one. Populism is a form of politics intended to get the support of ordinary people by giving them what they want. So populists are people lacking in principle, they're irresponsible, they make promises that they haven't really thought of, and so on. Who do we think of? Some of the best examples are in Latin America, but probably today, Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson has frequently been described as populist, and I think it's reflecting this kind of approach. You know, there's no real underlying ideology other than he's right of centre. He drifts along, he'll promise things. He doesn't really have any idea of the costings of making Britain more equal, levelling up the north, and so on. Certainly has very few specific policies. You can hardly call HS2 a specific policy for levelling up the north, and so on. This view that focuses on leaders, rather charlatan-like leaders who will promise anything, is often linked to a second supply-side approach, which says that populism is a style. It's a way of doing politics that isn't simply about promising anything. It has certain features, and I'll pick three just to give you a flavour for this kind of approach. The first is it's about, some would say charismatic leaders. Others would say macho leaders, almost always men, people who portray themselves as saviours of the nation at times of crisis. So we think of Donald Trump, the macho image, Make America Great Again, the MAGA hats, the very obvious male chauvinism of this type of leader. Modi would be the same in India. Bolsonaro, even more so in Brazil, if you're going back to using non-European examples. The second feature, the second stylistic feature, they tend to have a language, sometimes even a dress, a way of dressing, that makes them look ordinary. They try to identify with the people by adopting, sometimes the term is low politics and high politics. High politics is a certain count, a rather elaborate language. Low politics, you try and look like you're an ordinary bloke, the man of the street. Sometimes it can even be coarse, even the language of the street, because you're trying to identify with ordinary people. And the person I think of here, not so much coarse, but certainly falsely trying to identify with the people, is Nigel Farage. Now, Nigel Farage, my son knows one of his best friends' mother was a speechwriter for Farage and knows Farage well. Farage loves to be seen drinking beer in pubs. Farage doesn't particularly like beer. He doesn't particularly like beer. Farage is, as you might guess, for a trader, a lover of fine wine. But if you're trying to appeal to the people, you're trying to be a man of the people, do you appear on stage, on the platform drinking, the finest claret? No, you appear drinking beer in the pub, especially a working class pub, being as much as Farage can be a man of the people. That's very much the style of these kind of populist leaders. And the third stylistic feature, conspiracy theories. Populists, according to this approach, deal in conspiracy theories. You may have heard of the Hungarian leader, Viktor Orbán. And Viktor Orbán claims that George Soros, the great financier, Jewish-Hungarian financier, has a plot to undermine the West by bringing in immigrants who will replace Western Christians with this immigrant community and also be in the interest of business. This is a conspiracy theory, and I'm sure you've come across loads in America and QAnon and so on, all these conspiracy theories that surround Donald Trump. So this is an approach to populism that tends to identify with the movement and leaders. It's leaders or leadership in parties cynically acting to manipulate popular desires and having a particular style, this charismatic, this man of the people, this conspiracy-based style. And I think there's a lot in that, but as a definition, this approach has a lot of problems. One is, conspiracy theory, if we take this as an example, is not unique to populism. It's quite clear after Donald Trump came to power that large numbers of his opponents believed that there was a conspiracy between, if not Trump personally, at least the Trump camp and Russia in the election of 2016. Now, this was investigated by Mueller and various other people. And I think the conclusion to this is that there were certainly some strange relations between Trump and Russia over business and so on. But there is no evidence that Trump and his team were involved in what could reasonably or legally be called a conspiracy. But many on the centre and left believed in this conspiracy theory. So conspiracy theory, which you might think is something unique to populism, isn't. You can actually find it among lots of people. And it's surprising how many people in Britain believe in conspiracy theories. There's a team at Cambridge who've been working on this, and you'd be amazed at some of the percentages believe that Princess Diana was murdered by British MI6 or MI5 or whatever. There's something about conspiracy theory that's surprisingly appealing to large numbers of people, but I'll go off on a tangent if we get into that. And let's take the point about charismatic leaders, especially males. Not all people who are usually called populist fit this model. I'll just give you one. Probably something you haven't heard of unless you follow German politics or you're interested in populism. There's a German who's the parliamentary leader of the Alternative for Germany party, AfD, and she's called Alice Weidel. Alice Weidel is not at all what you'd expect from populist central casting. She's a female in her early 40s. She has a PhD in economics. She's an ex-international banker. She speaks Mandarin. She's openly lesbian and lives with her Sri Lankan partner. Not at all what you'd expect from this stylistic model of a charismatic male who uses a popular language. She's a highly educated woman. She's a technocrat. But she is in the German Bundestag. She is the parliamentary speaker for the AfD. So I would argue that, continuing on this first point, how to define populism, we really should see populism in a different way. We really should accept that it's an ism. It's a body of ideas that can be manipulated by leaders, but they also can be believed in sincerely, that some populists really do believe in these ideas, both leaders and people who support populists. So it could be bottom-up as well as top-down. The first set of approaches are top-down. They're at leaders, they're at parties, how leaders and parties manipulate people. If you look at ideology, it can be used in a manipulative way, but it also can be a set of genuine beliefs. People believe this. And certainly if we look at the origins of the term populism, certainly in party politics, some people trace it back to ancient Greece and Rome, but if we look at party politics, the first party to call itself populist emerges in America in the late 19th century, the People's Party. And that's a very rare example of a party that called itself populist. And this was a bottom-up movement. It starts among small farmers, small towns, people who worked in small factories and so on. So I want to call populism an ideology. And I want to argue that it's what's called a thin ideology. It doesn't have many ideas in it. It's like Marxism or even conservatism, which are quite complicated ideologies. And it's usually called by academics a thin ideology. Thin because it needs to join with another ideology to get a more coherent program. So, for example, it quite frequently, historically, is joined with socialism, hence Chavez. So populism and socialism produce Chavez. It often, and recently more commonly, combines with nationalism. Nationalism plus populism, Marine Le Pen in France, and so on. It has two main tropes, two main ideas. Firstly, that the will of the people should prevail. This should be the true force of government, the will of the people. And this obviously forces them to ask, who are the people? And populists tend to identify the people with what's usually called by academics a heartland, a kind of set of ordinary, decent people who really are the people who should be listened to, but often form a silent majority. In history, they are often farmers, people in small towns, and so on. Obviously, in modern society, you don't tend to identify quite so specifically with this kind of person. Secondly, so the first, the will of this people should prevail. Secondly, that this people's will is not being heard or listened to. Why? Because a set of distant elites are the ones who really run society. And these elites can vary. There can be anti-Semitic forms of it, where the Jews are the distant elite, but it usually is a focus more on the politicians, experts, technocrats, and so on. These are the people, rather like the EU. Who runs the EU? It's not the people who run the EU, it's these faceless Brussels bureaucrats, these professional economists, the business lobbies that spend fortunes to be in Brussels lobbying and getting their interests over and so on. And these elites don't just really run the country or the international economy. These elites look down on us, the ordinary people. So think of 2016, think of America, think of Hillary Clinton talking about Donald Trump's supporters. A basket full of deplorables, she said. Not the cleverest thing to say, really. What does Trump reply? He was laughed at for it, and I'm no admirer of Trump, but I can see where he was coming from. I love the poorly educated. So two main tropes. One, the will of the people should prevail. Two, the will of the people is being thwarted by these elites who not only pursue their own or business and corporate interests, but look down on the people, they despise us. So, my first approach. How to define it? I think populism can be defined in terms of cynical leaders, in terms of a style, but I prefer to define it in terms of a set of ideas, these last two sets, these last two tropes about how politics is looked at. Secondly then, why is populism seen by almost all commentators as such a threat? Why does virtually no one want to call themselves a populist? I think the first answer to that is obvious. If you take my first approach, how can being cynical, promising things to people that they want but you haven't costed or you haven't thought about, I mean, that clearly is dangerous. I mean, especially if you look at Latin American politics, and there have been lots of big populist leaders in Latin America. Usually the populist comes to power, and not long afterwards the country goes bankrupt or there's a run on the peso or whatever, because the populist leader is completely irresponsible. And similarly, things like conspiracy theory is clearly very dangerous in the way it makes people a target, certain elites, the way it makes them hold irrational views, and so on. Having said that, I think because populism can be seen as a style, a lot of people who are called populists actually, in my view, aren't really populists, or they're quasi-populist. I think that's true of Donald Trump. A lot of work's been done on Donald Trump's rhetoric when he first announced he was going to run for the presidency in 2015. And his rhetoric was littered with the word I, because he's appallingly narcissistic. I mean, he's obsessed with himself. He has no underlying ideology that's worth speaking of, because Trump actually had been thinking of running for the presidency for a long time. And he had been a member of the Democrat Party longer than he'd been a member of the Republican Party. And he also angled to run as an independent. But if you look at Trump's rhetoric as he runs into 2016 election, the I references decline. They don't disappear, but they decline. And what you begin to get is the will of the people, the ordinary people. And you begin to get Trump identifying with ordinary people. So WWE, wrestling, very working class sport in America. He appears with the promoter of WWE wrestling, McManus, on television. They actually have a mock wrestle, macho mock wrestle, working class. NASCAR, which hardly counts as a sport in Britain, the biggest spectator sports in America, stock car racing on oval tracks. Trump, very working class sport. Trump goes to NASCAR racing. He's pitching into this model. So I would say that Trump is more of a style populist than an ideological populist. In fact, if you look at what Trump actually does in office, he only has one major legislative achievement, and that is a tax reform. And that tax reform really came more out of the mainstream of the Republican Party than populism. It did very little for ordinary people, the working class. He failed to deliver on infrastructure, a new health system, all sorts of things that he promised to help the poorer people in 2016. So I think if you look at this first approach to definition, it's cynical leaders promising anything with a macho style, etc., etc., etc. You can see why they're seen as dangerous. But are they really all populist? So let's turn to the second approach, the approach that I prefer, the ideological approach. And why are they dangerous? I mean, the word democracy comes from two Greek terms, demos and kratos, rule by the people. So what could be more democratic than having a first trope, let the will of the people prevail? I mean, surely that's democratic. Now, I think to understand the attack on this side of populism, you need to distinguish between the word liberal and democracy. It probably isn't true for most people in the street, but academics tend to use the word liberal democracy to talk about America today or Britain today and so on. So democracy, putting it very simply, rule by the people. What do we mean by liberalism? Liberalism emerges in the early modern period of European history against a background of wars, religious wars, appalling religious wars, mass killings, torture, burnings, and so on. And liberalism very much stressed individual rights, and it very much stressed tolerance. It was very much a response to religious wars, appalling religious wars. So one of the key aspects of modern liberalism is the celebration. The jargon term, academic term, is pluralism. We could call it difference. You have different points of view are all legitimate. Critics, of course, would say liberalism lacks a true belief. There's no soul to it. There's no fundamental belief. It's this emphasis on relativism, but we'll sidetrack into liberalism if I go down that line. Let's go back to populism. Populism tends to believe there is a heartland, and the heartland tends to be homogenized, so there's only one true people. Now, this true people obviously could be an ethnic people. If this true people is an ethnic people, ethnic minorities have no rights, they're delegitimized. This true heartland could be associated with male dominance. So if we look at a party in Spain called Vox, and Spain until recently was one of the countries thought completely immune to the far-right populism, whatever you want to call it, partly because of the Francoist legacy. Vox now has about 17% of the vote. It's come from nowhere to 17% of the vote in 3 years. Vox very much has this male-dominant view of society, so it identifies the heartland with a traditional male role. So if you have that kind of view, then clearly these types of populists are very threatening to women's rights. If we look at Hungary, Viktor Orbán, I mentioned earlier in connection with conspiracy theory, Viktor Orbán has coined the term illiberal democracy. That's what he seeks. He wants Hungary to be a democracy, the people shall rule, but it will be the true Hungarian people that don't accord rights to homosexuals, lesbians, has a very traditional role for women and so on. So you're beginning to see that these populists homogenize the people. They're very threatening to minorities. Now, I think these arguments are good arguments, and they're interesting arguments, and I think particularly in countries with a weak democratic tradition, or particularly in countries where traditional male values are strong, populism can be very threatening, both to democracy and women's rights more generally. But I think there are dangers in this argument if we look at the more stable democracies, because if we look at the more stable democracies, populists don't all fit this pattern. Let's take the Netherlands, which is one of the most stable and in some ways liberal of the countries that we would normally call a liberal democracy. The populists in the Netherlands support the use of more referendums. They don't want to destroy democracy. They want more referendums to have the people's will prevail more. They don't want to abolish parliament. They don't want to abolish women's rights, nor homosexual rights. In fact, the first important Dutch populist was a man called Pim Fortuyn, who was assassinated in 2002. And Pim Fortuyn was an academic, a media academic, so he was not an unintelligent man, and he was openly gay. And he defended Dutch values, particularly against Islam, in the name of Dutch tolerance. Let me just conclude my second section by putting it this way. If we look at present-day society, we have two sets of values politically. We have liberalism and democracy, and they can be in tension. So democracy, simply rule by the people. Liberalism, there are individual rights, we should tolerate diversity, etc., etc., etc. Now, a very famous phrase that comes from the 19th century, John Stuart Mill, de Tocqueville, and so on, the tyranny of the majority. Liberalism does not accept that a majority necessarily is right. A majority cannot remove certain rights that are inalienable rights and so on. Now, what I think the populists want to do in established democracies like the Netherlands or UKIP in Britain is not push women back into the kitchen, not push homosexuals back into the closet, not make Britain a white country. What they want to do is alter the balance between democracy and liberalism. So democracy, meaning rule by the people, becomes more important, and liberalism, this whole series of rights, becomes less important. It's a question of balance, not a question of absolutes. And I think in some ways I would argue that these kinds of liberals in the more established democracies are more like a canary in a coal mine. What they're telling us is there are danger signals. And what they, in these countries, do is tell us we need reforms. I'll come back to that later. I think they're not so much a threat to democracy as a way of preserving democracy more than certain aspects of liberalism. Let's turn to my third question. What's driving these movements? If we were to look at this carefully, we'd have to look at each country in turn. All these countries have specific factors. You know, have to look at the American political tradition, the role of Facebook in 2016 and so on. We'd be here all day if we did that. So if you've read Matt Goodwin's and my book, we've tried to encapsulate a lot of ideas in the term, or in a term, the 4 Ds. There are 4 Ds driving the populist movement forward. And the first D is distrust. Massive distrust of politicians. Now, some critics of populism say what you have is a group of people who are trying to overthrow populism. They're trying to create a more authoritarian state. They tend to want strong leaders to rule. I think this is very misleading, especially again in the more advanced, the more stable democracies like Britain and Netherlands. And remember too that some of these terms are vague. If you say you support strong leaders, do you mean Adolf Hitler or do you mean Margaret Thatcher? You don't have to like Mrs. Thatcher to accept Mrs. Thatcher's in a different league to Adolf Hitler when it comes to democracy. And also in opinion polls, it's often interesting if you ask people a question to reverse the question. So if you say to people, do you think we need more strong leadership? What if you ask them, do you think we need more weak leadership? No one would dream of saying we need more weak leadership. A lot of the opinion polling behind this is very misleading. And if we had more time, or we were a social science class at university, we could get into the misleading opinion polls. Now, I think what you have to remember when we talk of distrust of politicians is there's a long tradition dating back to ancient Greece of suspicion of what was to become known as the masses, or the plebs if we're in Roman times. The masses are irrational, they're stupid, they're ignorant, and so on. This traces back through the French Revolution. It comes into the 20th century. Remember the Nazis, we often think of the Nazis as coming to power through violence, and the Nazis were violent. But in 1932, the Nazi party in free elections had more than double the vote of the next largest party. They were a big party in fair elections and so on. So after the Second World War, you get a return to this idea, we've really got to be careful of the masses. These masses are ignorant, stupid, given half a chance they'll vote for extremism again. And a big group of thinkers grew up in the 40s and 50s, especially in America, but also in Britain, who are called apathy theorists, who basically said, well, democracy is a good thing, but what we don't want is people participating too much. Let's keep them at home watching television with their new Cadillac in the drive or whatever. This is what we want. Have elections, but let's keep the masses out. And there's a very, very famous aphorism from the 1950s in America. There's presidential elections in 52, 56, won by Eisenhower. And Eisenhower's a Republican. And his opponent, Adlai Stevenson, was quite an intellectual American Democrat. And at one meeting, one of Stevenson's supporters came up to him and said, "No, Mr. Stevenson, I'm sure you'll be pleased to hear that every thinking person in America is going to vote for you," to which Stevenson replied, "I was hoping to win." And I think that sums up this kind of view that's come from not just political theorists, but elites, that the masses are something to be suspicious of. And that isn't simply just on the right, it even comes into the centre and part of the left. A lot of the Labour Party's tradition historically has been Fabian, it's been elitist and so on, rather than guild socialist or bottom up. And I think we can see why people have become alienated from politicians if we look at other things. I mean, let's look at the composition of parliaments and legislatures. Now, in some ways, they've become more diverse. If you look, for example, at the American Congress, you've now got not only far more women, you've got women of colour. This is obviously a sign of progress. But if we look around the world, in other ways, legislatures have become less representative. In 2018 in America, and look at the Senate, look at elections to the Senate, the average expenditure of the winning senator in those elections was $19.4 million. This is only possible for either people who are individually rich or backed by extremely rich donors. And of course, what you get in politics, you can see it especially in America, where people like the Koch brothers have given tens of millions of pounds, almost entirely to the Republicans, is vast amounts of money slushing around politics. Not simply in America to the Republicans. Hillary Clinton, 2016, charged $225,000 a pop for talks to bankers and others. It went to the Clinton Foundation rather than her personal funds, but that's what she was charging, and these bankers weren't paying the money because they thought the Clinton Foundation was as good as the Humanists, they were paying it because they wanted influence. Look at I think they're still to come out, the scandals surrounding Boris Johnson and the COVID pandemic. Now, okay, decisions had to be made quickly. In those situations, you're going to make more mistakes than normal. But it's pretty obvious there was massive cronyism, people in the know, and so on. And that story has come out partly, but I think there's more of it to come out. And let's finally just look more specifically at who is actually in these, who's in these governments and parliaments. I'll give you some British figures. In the last two general elections, and we look at people in the House of Commons who were working class by occupation before entering the House of Commons. Not working class by birth, what your parents were, what you were before entering the House of Commons. It's about 3% of the House of Commons are working class. We look at lawyers, Nothing against lawyers. My daughter's a hedge fund lawyer. They don't usually admit to that. Lawyers, 8%. So more than twice as many lawyers in the House of Commons as people who are originally working class before entering politics. And let's just take a simple statistic about the first Labour government in Britain. The Labour governments recently have been very much middle-class governments, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, and so on. But if you look at 1945, the first majority Labour governments, Prime Minister Attlee went to Haileybury Private School in Oxford. But the so-called Big Three, the next two in the Labour Party, Ernest Bevin and Herbert Morrison, left school at 14, both worked extensively in working class occupations. This was a party with a very big working class, not just base as a vote, but leadership. I know we've got Angela Rayner and so on, so don't tell me there are exceptions today, but the Labour Party has very much become a middle class party. Two statistics to finish this section. 2017, Gallup asked people in Britain, who did they trust? Top of the list, doctors and nurses. 1 into the 90% British people trust doctors and nurses. Weather forecasters? I'm told they've got more accurate. A mathematician in Bath University recently told me that the 3-day weather forecast is now as accurate as the 1-day one 25 years ago, because the maths has got a lot better. It's not the satellites or the balloons, it's the maths, how they model it and so on. 75% of people trust the weather forecasters in Britain. Politicians? 1 to 7% of British people trust politicians. 2019 poll from YouGov. Do you feel let down by the establishment? 83% of British people said they felt let down by the establishment. So my first D, my first driver that's beyond simple protest, it goes back many years. Distrust of politicians, experts, the whole technocracy that tends to run national government or institutions like the EU. The second D, destruction. Destruction, particularly of local and national communities. Now, if you're looking at America, especially, I think we could talk about the destruction or the decline of religion, which could be a topic that interests this group in particular. But let's keep on local and national communities more. There's a big literature in social psychology that tells us that feeling that you belong to a community promotes a whole series of desirable values, such as happiness. You tend to be happier if you feel part of a community. You tend to be more trusting of people if you belong to a community, and so on. So this decline of community is very important in a lot of ways, not simply politics. Now, if we're looking at destruction, I think the first thing we need to look at politically is the way in which immigration has become an issue. In America, Donald Trump very much campaigned in 2016 on build a wall, keep out particularly illegal immigrants. A lot of people don't spot that in America, a lot of the debate is about illegal immigration more than immigration generally. And there are some very dubious statistics around which were used by Trump and his campaign team in 2016, which claimed that in 2050 or by 2050, America will become a non-white society. That's based on calling Hispanics non-white. And if you ask Hispanics in America what they are, a growing number argue that they are white. So that's quite an important point. But there undoubtedly is a major change going on in America where ethnic minorities are growing. Having said that, don't necessarily assume, if I briefly go off on a tangent, that they are anti-Trump. In 2016, 30% of Hispanics voted for Trump, in spite of Build the Mexican Wall, Mexican rapists, and so on. 2020, if I asked you, would more or less vote Trump? Probably say less, because Trump keeps on the same thing. White supremacists, there's some good people among them. Hate is a shithole, and so all the usual Donald Trump rhetoric. 2020, 38% of Hispanics voted for Donald Trump. The figure's going upwards, not downwards. It's very interesting, but I'm going into a sidetrack here. Let's look at Britain, which probably interests you more. If we look at Brexit, 2016, what did people tell opinion pollsters was the #1 issue? Answer, immigration. Now, I think this needs looking at very carefully. I almost think this damn lies on opinion polls sometimes. You've got to be very careful how you look at opinion polls. There's a lot of evidence that this is a misleading figure, and I'll try and explain this in various ways, especially if you go from saying immigration is the main issue to the fact or the claim that most British people are racist. That is a different point again altogether. In 2018, an organisation called Hope Not Hate, which is an overtly anti-racist organisation, ran a very big opinion poll and also an online study about attitudes to immigration. And what it found was that the online study was incredibly polarised. There's almost all online things are. If you've ever looked at Twitter or anything like this, there's almost nothing in the middle. It's a shouting match between two sides. So their online study was almost entirely, there are human rights, we've got no reason to keep people out, these are starving people, they've suffered torture and war, we should let everyone into Britain. That was kind of this camp. And then the other camp was we should let virtually no one in, either literally no one or only a very small number of genuine asylum seekers. But interestingly, Hope Not Hate commissioned an opinion poll, big opinion poll, stratified opinion poll. This found that 85% of British people were what were called balancers. And balancers were, yeah, we like immigration if it's doctors or in certain situations, but we don't think there should be unlimited immigration. The other 15% was split almost equally between the open borders and the virtually no one in group. And I think that's probably a much more accurate picture of Britain than the view that Britain's racist. I think what you have are a lot of British people who are very happy about immigration and immigrants, and of course in many cases these people have been born here, second, third, fourth, fifth generation now. But they ask questions. They ask questions about what skills do we need in immigrants, and they ask questions about how we can integrate immigrants. Let me just take a statistic relating to the Muslim community. And it's very difficult to predict ahead how big the Muslim community is going to be in Britain because it depends on things like birth rates and so on. But Pew, which is a very respectable American polling organisation, says we're probably going to have about 10 to 17% of Britain Muslim by the year 2050. So the question of how to integrate Muslims is a very important one. But Muslims, as far as we can see, are increasingly living in their own communities and not interacting with white people. And of course, to some extent, that's because of white Islamophobia. But I would argue that in general, there's a lot of studies in Britain and in America that show that racism is much weaker than it used to be. For example, in America in the 1950s, if you ask people in opinion polls, would you mind if your daughter or son married someone from another racial group? About 90% of Americans in the 1950s say yes, they would mind. If you ask the same question today, it's about 5% say they would mind. It's possible people have got cleverer about how to answer opinion polls. You realise there's more of a liberal consensus and so on these issues. But I think that's wrong. I don't actually think values have changed. And that really is a big split among academics about the extent of racism in society. And this partly reflects a big change in how we understand racism. You may have seen in some newspapers in the last few weeks, months, the term critical race theory from America and so on. We used to think of racism as something that was conscious, something that we knew about. So if I think blacks are oversexed or I think blacks are stupid, that's something I think. Now, racism has increasingly become defined by academics, especially academics on the left, in terms of effects. So if the effect is in some way prejudicial or in some ways non-equal, even if there's no intention involved, then racism exists. And this is a very important switch that I really need more time to explain, because I'm going to be here all day. Let me just say, I think this whole issue of racism is very controversial. But I think racism is, in my opinion, grossly overstated in populist voting. I think it's loss of community, a loss of sense of belief, a loss of sense of purpose, rather than the traditional concept of racism where you look down upon people, you see them as inferior and so on. Let me turn to the third and fourth of these more quickly and then round up. Third, deprivation. Deprivation is more an economic concept.
But I don't simply mean poverty. If we look at who votes for populists, in general the poor don't vote. They simply don't vote, full stop. But I think if you ask simply questions about relative poverty, you're asking the wrong question. You need to ask questions about respect, the nature of work, what people get from working. And what you've seen is a decline, and this particularly is true for men, because in many cases these populist parties have a male bias in voting, so we need to understand why there's a male bias. A lot of traditional male jobs that gave respect, they're male jobs. I remember a few years ago going to a seminar about the closing down of the Concept steelworks in the north, and a person giving the lecture used the term, I'd never heard it before. He said these men had got new jobs working in light industry or distribution and so on, but they called them knicker jobs. Why? Because they weren't real men's jobs. A man worked in a steelworks. A man had a job for life. A man did certain things. Now, I'm not agreeing with that. I'm simply saying what you've seen is a very important change in the structure of work and the way people look at it. This very much is related to male conceptions of work, very much related to respect, but it also has economic implications. 60% of Americans are now in either the gig economy or paid weekly. Traditional working class jobs in America have largely disappeared. And in America, that's really important, because in America, say you worked in the Firestone tire plant in Akron. Firestone no longer have it, it's now a Japanese tire company. You not only had a job for life, you not only had good wages by working class standard, you had health insurance. What you've now got in America is large numbers of people working on low wages and so on. And a very important book came out just over 5 years ago, written by a French economist called Pelican, about inequality. And what he basically argued, and I think it's pretty well been accepted, is that income and wealth distribution in the advanced Western countries now is as high as it was in 1914. After a long period in the 40s and 50s and 60s of becoming more equal, we've become more unequal. The top 1% basically have done very well, and the top 0.1% have done incredibly well. If we look at the rest, especially below the top 20%, wages are virtually static in real terms compared to the 1970s and 80s. Take a final statistic. America, the American dream. The American dream is the belief that not only will you have higher living standards, but your children, your grandchildren, will have higher living standards. In the 1950s, if you ask Americans in opinion polls, will your children have high living standards, blah, 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 70-80% said yes. 2016, 24% of Americans thought their children or their grandchildren would grow up to have better living standards themselves. Among Trump supporters, 11%. This sense of a good future has largely disappeared among a big section, particularly of the working class. But it's beginning to come into the middle class too, especially as a new era of AI. Almost, as you can tell, I've got a cold, I'm beginning to lose my voice slightly. Fourth theme, so the third, deprivation. People who feel that they're losing out. Not necessarily, absolutely, because the poor, as I say, don't tend to vote. But they tend to feel they're losing out against their expectations, against the rich, and so on. Briefly, the fourth theme follows almost from the others, and this is de-alignment. Most people today do not strongly align with a political party. They don't tend to say, I'm Labour, I'm Conservative. This compares to the 1950s, when around 10% of people at most switch votes between elections. Now people rapidly switch from one party to another. They're open to new appeals. And this is one of the reasons why populists have been able to appeal to them. I mean, if you strongly believe you're Labour or you strongly believe you're Conservative, you don't tend to listen to somebody else. If you're a Conservative in 2000 who's beginning to lose the faith, and along comes UKIP, you may think, UKIP are making me a better offer. And this de-alignment is my fourth theme. So let's sum up. I don't want to talk for too long. I've already gone on for about 40 minutes. What I want to do in the Q&A is particularly try and pick up the fourth question: are we now going to see a decline of populism? But let me just remind you that in 2020, Donald Trump won more votes than in 2016. It's just Biden won even more. And if you don't follow American politics, you may not have noticed that this week, in opinion polls in America, which model what would happen in 2024, Trump is well ahead of Biden. If the election took place this week, Trump would win. Amazingly. What I've tried to argue, just summing up, three things. Populism isn't simply a protest. It's telling us first that politicians are not trusted, and we need changes in the democratic system that make people feel they're more listened to. Secondly, community has declined too much. We need to make people feel they belong, they have a role, they have some kind of meaning. This doesn't have to come from religion. I'm sure you can tell me where it will come from. This is something that really matters, this way in which societies become more individualized, more consumerized, more narcissistic. There's a big literature on millennials and narcissism. It isn't just Donald Trump who's seen in these terms. And how can we produce a society that has a different set of moral values that makes people feel more belonging, more ethical? I think populists don't necessarily articulate this very well, because I think the gist of what I'm saying is that most populists tend to be less educated, smaller town, etc., etc. They're not, in general, they're not intellectual. Populism hasn't produced a body of thought in the way that socialism has produced a body of thought. But it doesn't mean that ordinary people don't understand what the issues are, and it doesn't mean that they don't have views, even if they're not particularly well expressed. And my third and main point, because de-alignment, my fourth, is really a consequence of the first three, we've become far too unequal. We've got to face the appalling inequalities that we have in our society today. And unless we face that, it's hard to see how we are going to produce a more understanding, a more stable political society. And in some ways, I think COVID has helped. It's made us realize we're all in the same bucket. It's made us realize that a lot of people who are low paid in hospitals, porters and nurses, not that well paid, deserve more. But it's also pointed to a lot of other things. Think of working from home. American figures, we don't have accurate British figures, but the best figures come from America. Working class America, less than 40% can work from home, even 1 day a week. Middle class, especially professional middle class America, around 80 to 90% can work at home. Now, we're not sure how that's going to last. Maybe you'll be pulled back into the office, but it's another stratification where the quality of life will be much higher. It looks likely to be much higher for the middle class. It isn't simply a quality of life based on income or division. So I think my final point, I would argue that populism is far from gone away, that these three drivers really are still very powerful, and that certain recent developments like COVID, I could expand on, will continue to drive it. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Roger, for that very stimulating talk. And we now have, we've got about half an hour, in fact, for Q&A. So I'm sure there are some questions bubbling up. And but what I'm going to do is just come around with one of these microphones. Phil, the blue one. And so we switch that on. And when you have a microphone, just make sure that you speak into it, point it at your mouth, and then we'll be able to hear what you have to say. So, do we have any questions bubbling up? Yeah, Gary and Francis. Okay, Gary first.
Thank you. Great talk. Thank you very much. I was going to ask...
Gary, just point it at your face. That's
okay, sorry. Yeah, thank you. The independent two referendums, both asking, do you want to be a member of a super-state? One was the Scottish independence vote, which was almost cast by media as a vote for freedom, But the Brexit vote was seen as a populist vote. How do they... is that a correct perception? And sort of what do you think about the different perceptions of those two really quite similar referendum?
Good question. I think what you remember is a point I made early on, and that is almost all journalists, almost all academics use populism as a booter. It's something to... So the vast majority of mainstream journalists, the vast majority of economists, experts, virtually all my university colleagues, not just in Bath, and a lot of other academics, were hostile to Brexit. So they were trying to put a label on it, populism, that was very much in keeping with the Cambridge definition. It hadn't then come out, but that it was based on a long tradition of seeing populism as people making false claims. So, for example, the battle bus with £350 million of NHS money, is going to be, EU money is going to be spent on the NHS. And Boris Johnson, I mean, in some ways, really fits that opening definition. I mean, here's Boris Johnson, who probably was more Remain than Brexit, a year before the referendum was called, has a look at it and thinks, well, what's in it for me? And I think he actually, in this case, was more influenced by the Conservative Party, yes, who would be the voting group for him to become leader, than the electorate, because I suspect when he made the decision, he probably thought the vote would go for Remain. So if we're thinking of populism as a bunch of cynical politicians making decisions in their own interests and promising people things that really are false, I mean, the 350 million was ludicrous, because the money we pay into the EU, well, obviously we get some back, but there are a whole series of dynamic arguments. It was just a lie, full stop. So I think the university class, the media class in general, I don't over-homogenise it because they're alternative media sources and the Daily Mail's not the Guardian. I think the portrayal of Brexit was largely hostile. Scottish independence was more tricky. I mean, firstly, Scotland has its own independent media network, and that was split, but it was much more positive. And it did raise some different issues, because there's a discussion that runs well back in political theory about self-determination. Does a state, or does a society, a nation, have the right to self-determine? You get exactly the same argument going on now for many years in Catalonia, in Spain and so on. So I think that was a more tricky one. Some academics could see it as fitting into a long tradition of legitimate action, whereas Brexit was seen by, I'd say, 70% plus of academics, mainstream journalists, experts, economists and so on, as something that was, wrong, that this was foolish. And of course that led them to stereotyping supporters. So supporters of Brexit were stereotyped as old males and so on. There was the joke, if we can rerun the referendum in 5 years, we'll win, the Remain will win, because so many of the old will have died off. And I mean, that was only half a joke, it was half believed. And whereas if we look at who voted for Brexit, it is true that there was some skewing towards the older groups. But the real problem was the young didn't vote. The young who in polls said they were pro-EU didn't turn out to vote in any great numbers. And the other statistic that's very interesting about Brexit, and this is why did the polls get it wrong? Because the polls consistently predicted a lead of at least the reverse of what it was. So at least 52-48 win, sometimes higher. And the answer, the jargon term for academics, is called differential turnout. And it's the same term for young people. People who answer opinion polls don't necessarily vote. And what happened in 2016 is the reverse. People who normally didn't vote turned out to vote. And these were the people who were absolutely pissed off about politicians, elections, the democratic system, but not the democratic system that they were Nazis or communists. They wanted their voice to be heard, but didn't think it mattered. And here they were given a chance. One-off vote, we get this win, we will win. So I think Brexit's very interesting, because it tells us a lot about the opinion of the chattering classes. Mainstream journalists, obviously not
Facebook and so on, and mainstream journalists, mainstream academia, mainstream experts, they're all pro-Remain.
Okay, Francis, you were next. I'll get to Barry and Jeremy. Yes, just hold it and speak, that'll be fine.
Thank you for the talk, which I found very interesting. And I wondered with this audience whether you would like to say whether you see Christianity as a very populist movement, led by men up above, right the way through, very docile women, and they're going to put down the mighty from their seat, and I can't remember the rest of it, but the humble and meek were going to do very much better. That seems to me quite populist.
Well, I'm not a religious scholar, but I'll try not to duck the question. I think Christian religion differs dramatically. Now, I would see the Catholic Church as the opposite of populism. It's a very authoritarian and hierarchical organisation, and so on. And I think that's true of other Christian churches. But there are different Christian churches that are very much bottom up. So if we go back into the 18th century, the Methodists and the whole series, these are the ones who didn't want priests. They rejected a lot of the Catholic Church. I mean, so I think we can't homogenize Christianity. There are different types of Christianity, and they probably appeal to different sorts of people. The people in America who are authoritarian, they like hierarchical organizations, will be attracted to a different type of church. To ones who don't, Christians who don't have those values. But I mean, you're right, that Christianity is very important to Donald Trump. It's something I didn't really talk about because, I mean, it's hard to believe that a man who looks like he's irreligious, he's certainly immoral in any reasonable sense of the word, the evangelical Christian vote in America heavily went for Trump. About 90% of them voted Trump, which is very hard to understand. And I think there are two reasons for it, two broad reasons for it. One is American religion is declining if you measure it as religious practice. And we take Muslims and so on out. We look at Christian. The number of Americans who go to church regularly or describe themselves as Christian is declining. It's now regular practice in the 20-odd%, way above Britain, but in a long way down. And I think there's a fear that something needs to change, and there's an argument in psychology that this is about existential dread. When you think your way of life, what all the things you stand for are highly threatened, you become a risk taker. Whereas a conservative with a small c tends to avoid risk. So these Christians in America, I think, had existential dread. They actually thought their whole belief system was threatened. The second argument, I think, why a lot of the evangelicals went for Trump is a very specific reason. They thought, and they're probably going to be proved right, that Trump would appoint people to the Supreme Court that would change legal decisions that would have massive implications for them. And we're about to see this come up in 2022. Wade versus Roe is the 1973 decision, which essentially legalizes abortion. And this is now under question. And there could be, I think you probably next year won't see Wade versus Roe overthrown, but you could see a decision that basically knocks abortion back to the first few weeks, which is what Texas has just done. I think it's the first 6 weeks, which is often people don't know they're pregnant within their first 6 weeks. So this is why a lot of the evangelicals went for Trump. It wasn't just existential dread. They thought the Supreme Court would see, and he made 3 appointments to the Supreme Court, remember, would bring in changes that would be much closer to how they understood Christian doctrine. Remember, most of these populists are not overtly Christian. America is atypical. I mean, UKIP was not a Christian party. I'm not saying there weren't Christians in UKIP, but it's not a Christian party. If you look at Marine Le Pen, in France, Marine Le Pen is a divorcee, and a double divorcee. They all have an element of Christian rhetoric, but that Christian rhetoric tends to be anti-Muslim. Because what they want to do is they want to talk about a Western tradition, which obviously, even if you're not personally Christian, you have to accept that Christian values are important to the Western tradition. I mean, some people see liberalism as the secularization of Christianity. So render unto Caesar what is Caesar, render unto God what is God. It's pretty much the religious version of this. There's a public sphere and there's a private sphere. So that this a lot of the rhetoric that you get in Europe from populist Christianity isn't true believer. It's a tradition. There's a Western culture that is threatened by this Islamic culture.
Francis, I know you're going to do a follow-up there, but I'm going to try and get some. Roger, would you be happy if I took maybe 2 or 3 questions, just to...
roll them together,
just so that we get as many questions in as possible. Jeremy, I think you've been waiting for a little while.
Stand up. I thought your talk was very interesting. Thank you so much for coming. Sorry, can everybody hear me?
Just point a little bit more like that. That's it, that's better.
Yeah, sorry, I was just complimenting you on your talk, which I found most interesting and informative. I've got several questions, so I'll have to be selective. The first one I've got is your book. I'd never heard of your book before, to tell you the truth. And I'm going to rush to the bookstore or get onto Amazon straight away to order it. But out of interest, do you make any reference in your book, any mention of Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus?
No.
Yeah, all right, because they are, in many respects, the first true populists in Western history. 2 Roman politicians, if you like to use that term, of aristocratic, noble background, who decided to try to rescue Rome in the 2nd century BC. Major cataclysmic result of their efforts. So I've got that question, whether your book makes any reference.
There is a reference to those who trace populism back to the Roman period and the populares, the senators, so it doesn't mention the name, but that's about 1 sentence.
Yes, I know, but those 2 in particular are really pivotal in Roman history. Okay, just moving on very quickly, try to get through all these. One reason I believe that people don't wish or generally don't describe themselves as populists is because the term is so very poorly defined. I think that definition you gave from the Cambridge dictionary, whatever it is frankly rubbish, absolute rubbish, doesn't really amount to anything. And because they don't understand the term, they don't want to be identified with something which they don't understand. Simple as that. That's my belief. The third thing I'd like to bring up is that you made several references to populists as being cynical manipulators. I don't think that's justifiable. I think you could
I said that was one approach. I said I'd prefer by the ideology which they could truly believe in.
All right, forgive me. But I think one can also arguably describe them as populists, as being very idealistic in their approach. I mean, the Gracchi, those 2 Romans I just mentioned, were very idealistic. Populism, in essence, I believe, is an expression of democracy in action. Now, that expression can either be positive or can be negative. But both of those 2 extremes, if you like, are typical of populism. So, once again, very hard to sort of identify or define precisely what populism is. I mean, it's such a vague term that I really think it should be thrown away and discarded. Finally, a point about Donald Trump. You called him immoral a few minutes ago. I think, forgive me if I say that I think that's a very naive definition of Donald Trump. The simple fact is that all politicians, and I was very heavily involved in politics at one stage of my life, all politicians become professional liars. That is the only way they can become successful. I'm very, very cynical about politicians and politics in general, but I do believe that is true of all successful politicians. They're all professional liars. They're all in it for their own good, primarily. Finally, I would just point out that in the case of Trump, he's no less immoral than any other American politician. And I lived in America for 20 years, so I do know something about American politics. And I think you somewhat belittle his achievements because outside the domestic sphere, where I do have to concur with you, his contribution was relatively limited. In terms of international achievement, particularly forging peace between the Arabs and the Israelis and various other Middle Eastern nations, he was very, very successful, and we've a lot to be grateful to him for that. Okay, thank you.
Sure, thank you. There's quite a few things there. Roger, we've got quite a few people, I think, want to ask questions, but I think you've got quite a little bit there to respond to. So do you want to do you like to respond to what Jeremy's just said, and then we'll try and get a few more?
Well, no, I think that this is going to be an argument. I mean, I'm usually accused, my wife accuses me of being over-sympathetic to Trump. So, I mean, perhaps I didn't think, but then, you know, there's a little bit of devil's advocate in that when you find something that there's I think there's a difference between politicians as liars who know they're lying and politicians as liars who haven't got a clue whether they're lying. And I think the problem with Trump is he hasn't got a clue when he's lying.
Okay, so we've still got 15 minutes. Let's just get an indication of who would like to ask questions. So Barry, Simon, and you Aaron with us. Right, okay. If we can, I know we indulged Jeremy a little bit with his 5 questions, but if I can ask people to be brief so that we can get everyone in, that's great. Thank you, Barry.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk. Simple question. Do alternative voting systems, as opposed to first past the post, provide any defence against populism in your view? So are alternative democratic voting systems better or worse at dealing with this issue?
Okay, a really important question. Remember that in most European countries that have populists in government, they are in coalition government. So the largest party in Switzerland is normally seen as populist, but it's a coalition government. The Italian League, the Lega, when it was in government, was in a coalition government. So the moment you have a proportional representation system, you almost always are going to have a coalition government, which is not an argument for or against, it's just an observation. Some have argued that these proportional systems allow smaller parties into the system in a way that first past the post doesn't. And I think that's a good argument too. So if we look at a party that isn't populist, it's really neo-fascist. The British National Party has now disappeared into oblivion, but it had a phase from about 2000 to 2009 when in some parts of Britain it really had probably 10-20% following. And if you'd seen a PR system, then you would have seen a much more noticeable BNP. It probably would then have imploded because it was so full of thugs and others. But I think there are complicated arguments here. I think I personally am a latter-day convert to proportional representation. I think on balance it's the better system. But I don't think it's uniquely pro or anti-populist, other than it would almost always stop populists forming a single party government.
Sorry, just going to take this mask off. So very interesting. To some extent, what you seem to be doing was defending many aspects of populism and saying it shouldn't just be seen as a boo term. So I'd like to put a kind of case to the contrary, where those of us who do use populism in that way as something quite sinister, I mean, really we're talking about the use of the term as meaning the phrase a rabble-rouser. So, you know, like the kid in the school playground that's going to get everybody on their side and then they're going to beat the shit out of somebody. You know, people appealing to quite dark group emotions. Going back a few years under Margaret Thatcher, there was a local MP to me where I was working called Dr. Rhodes Boyson, and he would boast that I don't believe the public are wrong a single issue. And then he would say, capital punishment, corporal punishment, immigration, human rights for people that the press have labelled as monsters. You know, they shouldn't have sort of certain judicial protections. All these kind of very emotive issues, and he was, I mean, he wasn't somebody to be completely dismissed because he had been a successful head teacher of a rough school, but these were quite a kind of dark, emotional arguments and feelings that he was willing to draw on for his support. And moving away slightly, you know, but the same theme that you were saying, isn't it remarkable that so many Hispanics still support Trump? But another of these dark human feelings is the sense that the lower down the social hierarchy you are, it used to be said in the days of apartheid, the poor white people working in the mines in South Africa, they were just desperate to have somebody they could say, at least we're better than these black people that are allowed to come into the country to work. So kind of jingoism, chauvinism, wanting to be part of a group based on hating or feeling superior to another group. So, I mean, I would argue that the world in future, we desperately need to be a more international and cooperative world, but the populist politicians generally move us away from that, and it's worth keeping the term as a use of people who don't appeal to reason, appeal to quite dark emotions in human beings.
Well, I don't think I challenge that if you take my first set of defining approaches about cynicism and style and so on. I'll just expand briefly on the modern origins of the term. I take the point you can go back to ancient Rome. I mean, in the late 19th century in America, the populist movement very much stressed things like education. It was a bottom-up, farmers, small working class, small-town movement that wasn't at all irrational. It was also, we can't call it left-wing because it wasn't socialist. They didn't want to socialise the means of production. It was more Protestant ethic, hard-working ethic and so on. But they very much wanted to tame big money, big business. And in fact, if you know American history, there's a movement starts in around 1900 called the Progressive Movement and so on, Theodore Roosevelt and so on. A lot of the Progressive Movement took its ideas from the populist movement beforehand. But the Progressive Movement tended to be more educated, tended to be more middle class, better off and have more influence. And I think that's something we could see a parallel now, that we'll start to see people who perhaps 20, 30 years ago would have called themselves socialists, not call themselves populists, but pick up some of these ideas that we need to reintegrate the working class, to make them feel that they have more of a say, to stop the gross inequalities of income that have taken place and so on. And so I think we could see some kind of parallel movement, especially given the fact that, I mean, whatever you think of Keir Starmer, big ideas, don't think he's lacking. I mean, the Labour Party desperately needs some new ideas in the way that Tony Blair had the third way. Not the third way, but it was a kind of big idea, it was catchy. Keir Starmer is struggling. It's not just personality, that he isn't the charismatic leader. I think people can't really place Labour other than it isn't Corbyn. And increasingly, well, perhaps they won't be as dishonest and cronyist as Johnson.
Thank you. Yes, I initially started thinking that populism was the majority vote, and if I'd have said, what's the populist view in here, I'd say closing the windows and putting the heating on, so rather than dying from COVID, we wouldn't all leave with frostbite. But it seems that strong leader is out, and charismatic is out, and giving the people what they want is out, and all these things, but all politicians do this. And all politicians are, by the very nature of politics, the rich elite, even in this country, because to just give up your career and go into politics requires you to be wealthy enough to support yourself in that dilemma. So I think that populism seems to think, if I don't like this group, I'm going to attack it with a bad name, and I'm not sure that's entirely fair.
I'm a Remain voter in 2016, so I certainly wasn't a Brexit UKIP populist. But I mean, I wrote this book, and with a co-author who has somewhat different views to me, I'm trying to understand populism rather than damn it, and trying to, so instead of saying all Brexiteers are stupid old men, working class men who are going to die soon, say, look, where are they coming from? Not just narrowly on Brexit, but in a wider context. And I think that's what the book tries to do. And if I've succeeded in trying to make it clear, not that Brexit's a good thing, I remain an anti-Brexiteer, I remain a Remainer, but that I can understand where people are coming from. And similarly with Donald Trump, I'm certainly no fan of Donald Trump's, but I can understand where Trump supporters were coming from. As I said earlier, he's in a putative poll, he's back in the lead this week in front of Biden, quite comfortably. That will change because Biden's just got a big bill through on infrastructure, but it shows that Trump isn't down and out.
And Roger, you were saying to me earlier that your co-author, Matt Goodwin, has sort of become more sort of lever in his sort of identity since the Brexit vote. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think what's happened was once the vote had taken place, Matt decided, and I think an honourable democratic view, that a vote had taken place. It was a close vote, but the vote was to leave, and that we had to proceed as rapidly and sensibly, obviously there were lots of loose ends, as possible to leave. And that what you had was a lot of politicians who weren't trying to do that. I was running a bit slowly, so I didn't show you one or two newspapers, the headlines I have. This is a nice populist one. This is from the Daily Express. So ignore the will of the people at your peril. This is the will of the people. The Daily Express isn't really a populist newspaper, but it's picked up that rhetoric and so on. And back to the one that directly relates to David's comment. This is the Daily Mail. They vowed to deliver the Brexit Britain voted for, and had it in their grasp, but last night contemptuous MPs chose instead to plunge our despairing nation to chaos, the House of Fools. This is how politicians are being portrayed in the mainstream media. And I think Matt Goodwin's position, I didn't fully agree with him on it, was that once the vote had been taken, there was no possibility of a second referendum. I did wobble on a second referendum, I must confess. I did think it was a bit shady, but as a Remainer, I thought, is there any way we can slip this in? But that's back to politics being a bit shady and so on. Or can we, if we spin it out long enough, perhaps something will happen. So I think his position was perfectly logical and perfectly sensible.
Well, we had a wonderful debate here at Dorset Humanists prior to the 2016 referendum, and some of the debaters are here present on both sides. So we've always had different views here. We've probably got time for, I would say, one more. And Frank, you were just indicating. So Frank.
Yeah, you might think this is tangential to what you've been talking about, but I think it's the core of it. I just recently come across a book. It's called The School of Life by Elaine de Botton. I could recommend it to anybody and everybody. It's an absolute must. What it's really saying is that since the Industrial Revolution, things have gone on and mathematics and this, that and the other, they've been developed quite well, physics, chemistry, all that. But one thing that has been just completely left by the wayside is emotional development in individuals. And I think it's an absolute must for people to encounter the talk you're giving today with a more balanced and mature viewpoint.
Thank you.
I don't know if you read that.
No, I haven't read it, I'm afraid. I'll add it to my list.
He's a very interesting philosopher. Okay, look, I think we'll start wrapping things up now for our first part. So, Roger, it's been incredibly stimulating, and you've driven all the way from Bath today to be with us. We're very, very grateful. Thank you very much. Please give Roger another big round of applause.